Good morning. I'm Michael. Welcome to my channel, View from the Shed. Uh, in the last episode, I spoke of my father's exploits as his alter ego, Butch, and I mentioned that I would close the series with some comments about his early onset Alzheimer's and the impact that has on him and everybody around him, and hopefully to extract some lessons from having lived through that and managed through it that may be of help to others, if not at least resonate and let people know that they're not alone struggling through these difficult times and decisions. So first, let me talk a little bit about the disease and how it appeared in my father. So Charlie was for years somewhat forgetful, and we just became used to knowing him as being forgetful. But I would say 2 years, 3 years before he was diagnosed, that forgetfulness became severe and couldn't be ignored. You know, he would agree to pick you up at the airport and then never turn up. He would come to your house, say hello. We'd be chit-chatting, and he'd say, well, I've got to go to my sister's house. And then he'd drive around the block and come right back and do the same thing. And he would do that 5 or 6 times. So you knew something wasn't right. So you've got to start to absorb that and understand what's going on. And it was actually Charlie who recognized it and went to see his family doctor and asked for some advice. He felt he might have a vitamin deficiency or something, and obviously his immediate fear or concern wasn't that he had Alzheimer's or dementia. So that started a process that led to his diagnosis and a family meeting that included my sister and my wife and my aunt, his sister, uh, to discuss the fact that he had already crossed the threshold of not being cognitively fit to manage his own affairs, and that we needed to gather our strength to deal with what was coming. And we did that uh, initially, but you know, this is Butch. Butch is not easy to manage. Butch stood down motorcycle gangs. He has faced all kinds of danger and issues and broken cops' jaws. So standing in front of Butch and telling him, you know, you might not be able to drive is not an easy conversation. And more importantly, he inherited a small amount of money, not that small, but not kind of life changing. And I tried to work with him to manage that money, to invest it, even in GICs or savings accounts. And he had always in his pocket a couple of $1,000, and he wanted total freedom to spend it. He had no other savings. He had no retirement savings. He had no pension other than the government pension. And he was surrounded by people who were quite willing to exploit his vulnerability. So that's another issue, is that evil appears and exploits vulnerability. And it comes from areas that you might not expect. So the areas that exploited my father's vulnerability, there were some elements in the community around the farm that took advantage of his situation. He had a couple of women in his life who were long-term, let's say, acquaintances, and they now had access to that cash. They had access to his banking card. They had access to the cash in his pocket. And when I eventually took over his affairs, I could see that about every second day there were withdrawals from his bank account, a couple of $1,000, $1,000. He had inherited $130,000, and it was gone in a year. There was $7,000 left in his bank account when I formally went to court to take over. So the other surprise attack wasn't just the women; it was his sister. She had some legacy issues around the inheritance that he had received from his mother, their mother, and she decided to act on her own without consulting the family, and she stole all of his personal belongings. The $7,000 in his bank account. She transferred one of his properties. He had a slum dwelling into her name, and she was in the process of selling the farm to take the money from that after getting an illegal power of attorney after he was declared incompetent. She was going to spend that money too, but she had a health crisis that prevented her from getting to the end of the loop, which set off all kinds of alarm bells for me and allowed me to intervene. So it's tragic what these type of events do. It's not dissimilar to the kind of potential infighting that happens after a death and there's arguments over inheritance. But this is more important. It's not about what you get after somebody dies. It's how are you going to support that person, and you have no idea how long they're going to live with this terrible affliction when it's been early onset Alzheimer's. My father was 58. He died at 72. So there's 14 years where he needed constant support, care, and financial assistance. And he had no savings, nothing to fall back on, except for those assets like the farm and the slum dwelling he owned. So that's the backdrop. And I don't want to get into more personal details around that, but I thought I would share that with you and then move into what I call the 7 lessons that I learned from this experience, and maybe some anecdotes to support those lessons. And hopefully they'll help you if you're in the same process to make it easier. It's never going to be easy, but to make it easier than it has to be. In my case, in my family's case, it was much harder than it had to be. So obviously, overriding all of these lessons learned are an overwhelming desire to provide care to the loved one who is not well and not going to get better. There's no happy ending to Alzheimer's or severe cognitive decline. You can ease the process, but there's no happy ending. And I was very lucky. I had my wife who was a former nurse, so she had healthcare experience. I had my sister who provided complete and total support to my taking over his affairs and managing his affairs, and provided good advice and input on areas that might be contentious. I also had other family members a little bit more distant that were willing to participate in a family council, which was important to making this legal and morally correct. So let's just put aside for a second that it's very important, it's critical, it's the central issue to worry about the well-being and the comfort level and the quality of life of the victim, and look at these lessons as elements that support providing that quality of life. So the first one for me was don't be in denial. I mean, it was clear to my sister, to myself, to my wife, to his sister, my aunt, that he was in serious cognitive decline for years. But we didn't intervene. He was butch. He wasn't easy to deal with on such things. And the more cognitive decline occurred, the more difficult he was to deal with. So I was in denial, and I wasted years that could have been used to intervene on the money that he had inherited and provide him a better quality of care leading up to long-term care. But I didn't. I was intimidated by him, and I backed down. And that fear does not lead to a better outcome. It leads to a worse outcome. So if I could do it again, I would have puckered up my asshole, and I would have been stronger, and I would have taken a stronger stand and intervened earlier with kindness and love, but with an understanding that this wasn't going to get better. The second lesson learned, important, really critical, is to be strong and determined. Once you are no longer in denial, once that you accept that this is going to require an intervention, and once you make that intervention, that's when the trouble starts. That's when, and I know my father's not that different than other people. That's when the butches appear and start saying, "No, I'm not giving up my car," or "No, I'm not going to get any assistance. No, I don't like that person that you have helping me." And those no's are a sign of somebody desperately trying to maintain their independence. A quality that I loved in my father, and I certainly have in myself. But the lesson for me was trust people around you and start building. If you want to participate directly in a care plan, do it when you have your cognitive abilities and decide what you want and what you don't want, and then the leeway that you're willing to provide people supporting you. And don't make those requirements unattainable. Like, I never want to leave my home, or I always want to live in a certain area. Those things are not always possible in a healthcare system that is severely stretched, and it creates additional um, burdens of guilt and frustration. So be strong and determined, because the minute that you are no longer in denial and you start to intervene, that's when it gets really, really difficult. And you have to act with the victim in mind, but you have to act with determination. The third lesson I learned from this exercise was you need to seize and hold the moral and legal high ground. In Quebec, it's pretty straightforward. If you have family members and you lose your cognitive abilities, there's a process, and you can circumvent that process in advance by deciding to give people power of attorney or to nominate them to manage your affairs. But if you don't do that formally, it's a free-for-all, and those evil people start to appear, and the exploitation begins. I can tell you, in my father's case with the farm, I went out one weekend, all the cows were gone. What happened to the cows, Dad? I don't know. I went out a weekend later, all the horses were gone. Where are the horses, Dad? Um, I don't know. I went out another weekend, and he had wonderful antique farm equipment and tractors that were worth quite a lot to collectors. Where are the tractors, Dad? I don't know. I came out a few weekends later. There was our pasture was full of logs and wood. Somebody had come by and clear cut our forest, apparently with his permission. And I couldn't get anyone to intervene, the police, nobody to stop the clear cut. I had to go to that person's house, a noted local ruffian, and pull a butch. And the only butch that I knew was the work that I was doing with the government, and threatened to expose his work to the tax authorities. It worked, but it could have led to mine getting a serious ass kicking as well, because these people were lawless. And but it worked. But that's the kind of stuff I had to deal with, and I'm sure millions of people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis as the population ages. So if I had had control earlier, if I hadn't been in denial, I may have been able to avoid some of these things by using the money that he'd inherited to have a permanent caregiver that I could manage and make sure that the priorities are being followed. So in Quebec, the process is quite simple. If you don't have these things declared in advance, you go through what's called the Curateur Public de Québec, which is the public curator's office. You have a family council meeting. That family council meeting evaluates the medical support for a declaration of incompetence, and then you have to go to the Superior Court of Quebec to have that declaration of incompetence and to be named curateur or guardian, and that guardianship is subject to the supervision of the family council, and it's also subject to the office of curateur public's observations as well. It requires annual financial reports and occasional audits. So at least there's some supervision and some structure around how the person who's managing their affairs can operate. It's quite, I mean, once the process kicks in, it's quite painless. All jurisdictions have a similar process. I know Ontario has one. It's called public guardianship. It's a little bit different names, but it's the same principle. And then you manage his affairs until he passes, and then you act as executor to his will and his estate. So that's what I did. I had the moral high ground of a family council to intervene after my aunt had stolen his property, and to begin the legal process of recovering his property, of which I did recover the farm, and I recovered the slum dwelling that she had given herself. I gave up on the $7,000. That was never going to happen, and we ended up settling and closing it. But I had to mortgage the farm in order to pay the legal fees to get all this done. So it was a lot of work, very complex. I had two babies in diapers at home, a wife that was a stay-at-home mom, and a $43,000 a year public service salary, and I was 4 hours away. So I won't understate the impact that it had on us and our family, but it was an act of love, and having the support of my sister and my wife and the family council made it all very possible. So that family council, that moral high ground, and the legal high ground of having the law behind you are critical to making it possible to get through the crisis. So I highly recommend seizing both the moral and the legal high ground. The fourth lesson learned: hope is not a plan. They're not going to get better. And if you hope that things will get better, they won't. They'll get worse. And the more you hope, the worse they're going to get, because you have to manage this every single day with passion and love and caring. But hope will not make this an easier task. I guess hope is most useful in applying to the quality of life of the victim. Always hoping that you can give them more comfort, give them access to better services. Hope there plays a role, but in the overall scenario of managing a close loved one that has dementia or Alzheimer's, it's not going to help. It's going to make things worse. Lesson number 5: respect the dignity and the quality life needs of the victim. That's the starting point for all elements of a care plan. What leads to greater dignity for the victim or maintained dignity? Taking into consideration that person's lifetime accomplishments and wishes. You know, in my case, my father was a driving force in nature, someone who loved to live. So he had to have somehow incorporated into this difficult plan, you know, some form of at least perceived independence to him. And we worked at that every day. My sister helped, my wife helped, and my very young children were critical in that plan. I had 2 sons that were 4 and 5 at the period where he still had a little bit of cognitive ability. He could string together 1 or 2 sentences. And, you know, I gave them as much access as was reasonable for 4 and 5-year-olds. And it was successful. I think it improved his quality of life. So respect dignity and quality of life needs, and make those the center of whatever care plan you put together. The 6th item is the hardest one to say out loud and the hardest one to accept. The victim does not have the cognitive ability to direct their care plan. The time to direct their care plan is before they lose their cognitive ability. I've lived through this a second time with my wife's family. A little different, but some similar conversations. You know, things that her mother, who's 95, declared are musts, are things that can't be done. But the family is trying to support her in that way. It took them years to get her proper formal care because she said she didn't want to leave her home. Obviously, you don't want to leave your home. Obviously, you don't want to be institutionalized. But one of the things I learned by attending Alzheimer's Society meetings was, in many cases, the caregiver, especially with elderly patients, dies before the Alzheimer's victim because of the stress and the burdens of care. This is not something that normal people equipped normally for day-to-day life can support on their own. This is real issues of not being able to go to the bathroom, being strong and physically independent, but not knowing how to go to the bathroom is a 724 care issue. And that's just a tiny example. My father, who was a man who would eat a hamburger with a knife and fork, would eat mashed potatoes with his bare hands during that period of time. He forgot how to eat, forgot how to hold knives and forks. So these are not things that you can simply accommodate when someone says, I need to stay in my home. Of course you want them to stay in their home. If that's possible and the means are there are ways of making that happen. But in my father's case, he didn't save a penny for retirement. He spent it all, and he blew whatever he inherited. So there was no way on my $43,000 salary and my sister's homemaker at home that we could give him private care. And thank goodness for the Quebec system, because with all its faults, my father got dignified care and was well taken care of. And he had great affection from the staff. And he was there for 14 years. So probably not much longer than I lived with him. So it was a major event. So that's very difficult to accept, and it took me a long time to do it. But the victim cannot direct their own care plan. They can contribute to it through constant discussions, but you have to make the decisions based on what can be done and what can be afforded and what's in the best interest of the victim. That's why you're named the guardian. Um, I'll give you a little anecdote on that. My father insisted on driving, and at one point was stopped going the wrong way down a 4-lane highway against traffic. Now, if somebody had been killed in that, I never would have been able to forgive myself. But I just did not have the fortitude to take his keys. What ended up leading to him stopping driving was his car died, and it was leased. And the lease came to an end as the car died, and there was no way he could buy another car. So having a license became irrelevant. He had no vehicle. That was luck. I think he might have killed somebody if if that hadn't happened. And the final lesson number 7, which I hold dear to my heart, is consult, consult, consult. Consult the victim and consult your family counsel, whether you have a formal family counsel through a legal mechanism like I had, or an informal one because you've been given power of attorney and in a pre-directed care plan, you're in charge. Consult, consult, consult. It avoids conflicts during decision making, after decision making, and after this whole crisis passes and you move into um, managing inheritances and distribution of estates. So I hope that's been helpful for you. Actually, it was difficult for me to sit down and sort my thoughts on this. And if you found it useful, please let me know. If you've got questions about um, what I did in certain circumstances, or you've got a particular situation, I've been through this twice, once with my father and once more as an observer with my wife. Um, I can't provide formal advice, but I can give you insights into how we dealt with some of these situations, and I'd be delighted to help. So I'm Mike. This is View from the Shed. Please like and subscribe, and by all means, please comment on my lessons learned here. I'm sure there are many lessons learned out there we could add to the list that would help people in this crisis, because it's just getting bigger and bigger throughout North America and the Western world. Cheers.